Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. Colby's face was full of concern when he answered, "Nothing much. It's just that I thought you would be in a bad mood, considering what had happened." Roxanne froze for a few seconds before flashing a helpless smile. "I trusted all my colleagues in the research institute, but I ended up getting stabbed in the back. Anyone would be as moody as me if they were in my shoes. Jason is an old-timer in the research institute. I also didn't expect him to do something so foolish." Colby followed her into the office and uttered apologetically, "If I had known, I would have kept an eye on him yesterday." Roxanne sat on her chair dejectedly and said, "It has nothing to do with you. If I were in your shoes, I wouldn't have expected him to do something like that either." At that moment, all she wanted to know was the identity of the person who sent Jason the email. As Colby was taking a seat opposite her, he was observing her expression silently. "I wonder what the mastermind's motive is." Coincidentally, the storage room that Jason burned down stored Herbscape Group's medicinal herbs. Roxanne's heart skipped a beat when she heard those words because she suddenly realized something. It's so weird. Who else would know about Jason's son apart from the people in the research institute? "I can't believe the mastermind ended up using that against Jason," Colby continued. He was hinting at the fact that someone had gone to great lengths to destroy Herbscape Group's batch of medicinal herbs. Upon saying that, Colby stared intently at Roxanne's face to see if he could glean some information out of her expression. Although Roxanne's heart was racing, she acted calm and composed. "I've already told someone to investigate the email address, so I should hear back from that person soon. Let's talk about it afterward." Colby got nothing out of her expression, so he ended up frowning in annoyance. Seeing that, Roxanne forced a smile and said, "Thank you for your concern, Dr. Galloway. I'm exhausted. I'll need you to coordinate the research institute today." Colby nodded nonchalantly. "Okay." Roxanne thought Colby would leave her office after that, but he didn't seem like he was leaving anytime soon. Baffled, she asked, "Is something else the matter?" Colby seemed troubled when he asked, "Now that Herbscape Group's medicinal herbs are gone, how do you plan on salvaging the situation?" Roxanne felt a headache coming when he mentioned those medicinal herbs. "That's one of the reasons why I'm so angry. That batch of medicinal herbs is very important for the project. Since it's very rare in China, we had to take the risk and retrieve the medicinal herbs before Herbscape Group got sealed up. Yet everything has turned to ashes. As for what to do next, I'll have to discuss it with Jack. Obviously, the Research Institute has to be responsible for losing the medicinal herbs in the fire. It seems like I owe Jack an apology." Just when her temple was throbbing, Colby's voice rang out once again. "If you need help, I think I can figure something out to soften the blow." Roxanne suddenly came back to her senses when she heard that. "Do you know how to find those medicinal herbs?" Colby nodded slightly. "I'll try my best." At that, Roxanne gave him a doubtful glance. "That batch of medicinal herbs is rare because we could barely find it on Chenia's supply channels. If it's too tough of a task for you, just forget about it." Colby's gaze dimmed when he saw Roxanne doubting his capability. "I've been in Horrington for so many years, so I have some connections. Don't worry about it." Only after hearing Colby's response did Roxanne relax slightly. I see. I'll leave it to you, then. Feel free to come to me if you need anything," she said. Colby agreed. Roxanne couldn't help adding emotionally, "If you can find those medicinal herbs again, you'll solve a huge problem for me." Finally, Colby felt chirpy upon hearing Roxanne's tone. Ever since Roxanne went to the Research Institute, she had been solving all kinds of problems on her own. She would only let him, the person in charge of the Research Institute, help her with trivial matters. Therefore, Colby knew that despite her praises, she had always only regarded him as an ordinary researcher at the research institute. After all, he was nothing compared to the men she had by her side. This time around, he was rather surprised at the fact that it didn't take much to trick Roxanne into holding him in high regard. No one would have expected him to do so much just to create a distance between Roxanne and other men. It'll be so much better if Roxanne would follow my hints and shift her suspicions toward Jack and Lucian. Colby was elated when he imagined how Roxanne would drift away from those two men and toward himself because of what had happened. Don't worry. Since an employee of the Research Institute is to blame for this mess, I have an obligation to help out wherever I can. Colby put his satisfaction aside and pretended to be merciful. No matter what, Jason was still a senior employee at the Research Institute. Besides, he was doing it for his son. I hope you can show him some mercy, Dr. Jarvis. Roxanne felt slightly helpless when she answered, I'm not even planning on doing anything harsh to him. Since no casualties were involved in the accident, Roxanne's memorandum of understanding was enough to lighten Jason's charges. As for Jason's son, she would also help with the treatment. Colby smiled gratefully when he heard that. That's good to know. They chatted for a while more before he stood up and excused himself. Suddenly, Roxanne's phone lit up. She lowered her gaze and saw that it was a text from Benny. Benny had looked into the email address, but he found nothing. The email sender managed to stay hidden. The email address the person used was an email account without a domain. Since the perpetrator wouldn't use it again, it was impossible to find any information on it. Therefore, even Benny couldn't do anything about it. Just like that, Roxanne's heart sank once again. Colby noticed the change in her mood, so he asked in a concerned tone, what's the matter? Roxanne didn't plan on hiding that information from him, so she answered truthfully, I've received the outcome of the investigation on the email address. Colby narrowed his eyes upon hearing that. What did you find? Who told Jason to do so? Roxanne shook her head dejectedly. I've got nothing. Colby discreetly breathed a sigh of relief before putting on an angry expression. The mastermind is so well hidden, and he's definitely targeting Herbscape Group. Who is capable of doing this? Roxanne was feeling troubled. There aren't many people who can do so much damage to Herbscape Group and stay hidden from Benny's investigation. Coincidentally, I know someone who's that capable and has the reasons to do so. That person is none other than Lucian. Feeling that he had given out enough hints, Colby said nothing else and stood up to leave. Roxanne's face fell as she watched the office door slowly close. The only one she could think of was Lucian. If it really is him, I wonder what the hell was he actually thinking? The kiss last night was still fresh in her mind. If things are as Jack thought, did he do this because of me? At that moment, panic swamped her. Meanwhile, Herbscape Group was in chaos. After getting investigated by the two departments, all the mess Herbscape Group had in the past was exposed to the public. Dean was facing a lawsuit, and he was panicking to the point his mind was going blank. Left without a choice, he steeled himself and contacted Jack. He reckoned Damaris Group would not sit on their hands and watch as Herbscape Group collapsed after how the latter had provided Damaris Group that many medicinal herbs and how much money Damaris Group had invested in Herbscape Group. However, after a few tries, it became clear that Jack did not wish to pick up the call. Dean's heart sank, but he still held on to hope and called Jack's assistant. Unlike Jack, the assistant picked up the call quickly. It's me, Herbscape Group's chairman. Before Dean could finish his sentence, the assistant cut him off. I'm sorry, but Mr. Damaris is currently busy. Once he is done with his work, I'll convey to him that you've called. With that said, the assistant ended the call immediately. Dean's face turned ghostly pale as he listened to the engaged tone coming out of the speakers. They were both businessmen, and by then, he understood what Jack was telling him with his actions. In other words, Damaris Group was abandoning them. What are we going to do, Mr. LaCroix? The executives of the company were crowding around Dean, their faces ashen as if they had seen a ghost. Dean was already frustrated, and their voices only made him even more irked. "Yeah, what can we do? Tell me, what can we do? Am I the only one with a brain here? At most, we'll all be in jail together." These people are all haughty and suave at most times, but now, at a crucial moment, the only words coming out of their mouths are, what can we do? Livid, Dean slammed his phone on the table and snapped, what a useless bunch of people. The executives were already terrified at the prospect of imprisonment, and now, they were witnessing Dean's wrath. None dared to make a sound after that. After ending the call, the assistant lifted his head to look at Jack. What did he say? Jack had been in his office in Damaris Group the entire time, and he had overheard his assistant's call with Dean. After all, he was the one who instructed his assistant to pick up Dean's call. The people at Herbscape Group had been forced to the edge of the cliff, and Jack would like to see if they could come up with any good plans to deal with their crisis. However, the assistant shook his head and said, "As you said, he's here to ask for help from you." Hearing that, Jack mocked, what a loser. It's a miracle he even climbed all the way to that position. He's already at death's door, but he's still thinking of relying on someone else. I guess it's only natural for Herbscape Group to end up in this way with a chairman like him. What do you think we should do with Herbscape Group? Jack asked his assistant. His assistant furrowed his brows momentarily. Keeping Herbscape Group here after the trouble they've caused will be the same as holding onto a hot potato. Jack nodded in agreement and gestured for him to continue. When the assistant thought about how Jack had invested $12 billion in Herbscape Group, he found himself unable to continue speaking. Despite everything, $12 billion was a hefty sum. Even if Herbscape Group was a hot potato, keeping it around meant that they would be able to see where the $12 billion was going. If they threw the hot potato away, it would mean throwing the $12 billion into the gutters. Do tell me how you're planning to deal with this, Jack urged with a frown. Jack's voice snapped the assistant back to his senses, and he had no choice but to steel himself and continue. If we keep Herbscape Group around, I'm afraid it'll affect Damaris Group's reputation, so... Jack arched a brow. The assistant squeezed out, so, the best way to deal with this is to cut ties with Herbscape Group as quickly as we can. It's even better if we do it before the news of Herbscape Group's executives landing in jail spreads. That was what Jack thought as well, though his heart ached a little at the lost money. Nevertheless, having heard that someone was of the same opinion as he helped him make up his mind. We'll do as you say, then. Jack waved a hand. Didn't Farwell Group always want it? Do ask them if they still want it now. It was a pointless question, for everything so far was obviously done by Farwell Group. Without a doubt, Farwell Group would want Herbscape Group. However, the amount of the acquisition was another matter. Jack's heart ached again, but he felt it was better to get a little bit of his investment back than to keep Herbscape Group around. After all, not only would Herbscape Group not rake in any profits for him, but it might even bring more trouble to him. Mr. Damaris, are we really selling it to Farwell Group? The assistant hesitantly uttered. So won't we be doing exactly what Farwell Group wants us to do? Jack knitted his brows and said in dismay, well, what company other than Farwell Group would be willing to buy Herbscape Group now? Even if they wanted to, they wouldn't dare to. The assistant nodded fervently and replied, I'll work on it right away. With that, he turned and went out of the office. The moment the door closed, Jack swept all the documents on the table to the ground, wearing a scowl. Meanwhile, Herbscape Group had the same idea. Damaris Group was no longer going to lend them a helping hand, so they had no choice but to beg for help from Farwell Group. Unlike Jack, Lucian picked up the call the moment Dean dialed his number. It's been a while, Mr. LaCroix. What can I help you with? It came Lucian's deep, mocking voice. Dean shuddered involuntarily. Mr. Farwell, you're a magnanimous man. I was ignorant to have ruined the contract previously. Please don't take it to heart." Lucian barked out a laugh of disdain, and Dean's heart sank even lower. "Mr. LaCroix, you're coming to me to clean up after your mess because you realized Damaris Group can't save you, right?" Lucian questioned. Dean laughed dryly. "Mr. Farwell, please don't rub salt into my wound." Not wanting to waste any more breath on him, Lucian said, "Contact Mr. Queen about the acquisition. However, I hope you know well what the limits are." Dean quickly agreed to it. After ending the call, a furious look crept onto his face. He knew that they were nothing but sitting ducks at this point. Lucian meant to warn him about the price of the acquisition. He was warning Dean not to bargain. "If only I knew what was going to happen. I wouldn't have let Herbscape Group choose Damaris Group back then." Dean felt only remorse as he looked at the dialing screen. Jonathan soon accepted a call from Dean. As Lucian had already discussed with Dean about the acquisition, Jonathan easily bargained with the latter until he agreed to sell the company for a third of the original price. Dean could only mourn the loss silently. He knew that Farwell Group and Queen Group would take the opportunity to fetch a low price, but he never thought it would be this low. Nevertheless, he had no choice but to swallow his misery and submit to fate. After the negotiation of the price, Dean contacted Jack and informed him about the acquisition. Although the price was far lower than he preferred, Jack knew that he was in no position to negotiate for a higher price. Thus, he made no comments about it and waited to perform the equity transfer after the investigation. 2 days later, the investigation on Herbscape Group ended. The executives of Herbscape Group were all arrested, and a case was established. Jonathan arrived early to wait for the equity transfer. As a business partner, Lucian was there as well. By the time Lucian arrived, most of the executives were already escorted into the police cars. Dean was the only one left, signing the papers with a trembling hand. When Jonathan saw Lucian, he walked over gleefully while waving the documents in his hand. "It's a success." Lucian inclined his head in response. "How much is the price?" He had left Herbscape Group in Jonathan's hands and had not concerned himself with the matter the entire time. The merry expression Jonathan had on his face at that moment made Lucian sure that the former had to have bought Herbscape Group for a low price. "At a third of the original," Jonathan replied before chuckling. He then turned to look at the gloomy Dean and said, "He only has himself to blame for being so blind previously. This is just his lesson." Though it was a harsh lesson. However, it was not as if Jonathan had a hint of remorse in him. Lucian bobbed his head in response. That amount was similar to his expectations. "Mr. Farwell," Dean squeezed out as he came over to Lucian. All Lucian did was briefly glance at him in silence. Dean forced himself to continue, "Thank you for having mercy on me. From now on, Herbscape Group will listen to every one of your orders. We'll never go against anything you say." With that, he carefully studied Lucian's expression. Lucian remained unfazed. He only gave a quick glance at the police cars driving off. If Dean had not been the one most familiar with Herbscape Group, he would have been in the police car as well. When Dean looked in the direction Lucian was looking, he shuddered again and hastily clamped his mouth shut. He was afraid that Lucian would regret his decision if he were to say another word. Fortunately, Lucian ignored him. Once they were done with the procedures, he went away with Jonathan. A tisk, Jack even spent so much money on Herbscape Group. "What a generous man," Jonathan remarked with a sigh when he saw the 12 billion in Herbscape Group's financial statement. Lucian peeked at it before grinning in ridicule. It was clear that Jack had wanted to save Herbscape Group, but alas, his efforts were for naught. The money he had poured into the company had gone to waste. Well, he had this coming," Jonathan mocked. How dare he try to steal that person from us? He should have taken a good look in the mirror at himself." Right as those words were out of his mouth, he deliberately let his gaze drift to Lucian. Both knew who Jonathan was talking about. The mention of that woman made Lucian's eyes darken. Jonathan cleared his throat at Lucian's lack of response. I heard a fire broke out in Dr. Jarvis Research Institute 2 days ago. Hearing that, Lucian snapped his brows together. Jonathan was satisfied to see his response. What's the matter? Did you not know about this? Lucian nodded, his expression somber. He had not seen Roxanne since the kiss the other night. Therefore, he knew nothing of what happened to her. Although Estella would try to get news about Roxanne from Archie and Benny before telling her father what she learned, Lucian knew that Roxanne would not let the boys know that she had been in danger. Jonathan fell silent when he saw his friend's grim expression, and he waited for Lucian to speak instead. Was the fire a bad one? Was she hurt? Lucian could not help but ask. Jonathan lifted a brow. Won't you know if you go and take a look at her? At that, Lucian's expression turned dark again. Jonathan was bewildered by that. What does this mean? Did they have a fight again? If my memory serves me right, Lucian just asked me how he should create a romantic scene the other day. Moreover, we're doing this to Herbscape Group because of Roxanne. Why did his attitude toward her change again? Ahem. Jonathan cleared his throat tentatively. You and Dr. Jarvis. Before he was done with his sentence, the man beside him cut him off. Nothing happened. Jonathan's breath hitched, and he choked on his own saliva. Only after a long while of coughing did he finally recover enough to stare at Lucian with pursed lips. I haven't even said anything. Why is he in such a rush to explain to me? There's no way nothing happened. With that, Jonathan moved closer to Lucian and asked, be honest with me. Did you have a fight with Dr. Jarvis again? Lucian's already dark expression turned even darker. Rather than a fight, he was sure that Roxanne was trying to make him mad. Knowing his friend's character, Jonathan sighed in resignation. I told you so many times that you have to give in to Dr. Jarvis once in a while. Moreover, you were in the wrong. That made Lucian's frown deepens, but the irritation in his eyes dissipated a little. Jonathan continued, if you really had a fight with her, this would be a good opportunity. Lucian lifted his brow. What do you mean? I don't know whether or not Dr. Jarvis was hurt in the fire, but I know that the fire at the Research Institute burned the medicinal herbs they had gotten from Herbscape Group, Jonathan explained slowly. This batch of medicinal herbs is hard to get, and reobtaining it would be a chore for Dr. Jarvis. That being said, we now have Herbscape Group and their medicinal herbs. In other words, the resources they now had would be able to resolve Roxanne's crisis. Lucian lowered his gaze. Unhappy to see that response, Jonathan patted Lucian's shoulder and said, Aren't you courting Dr. Jarvis? This is a good chance. After all, no woman would be able to resist someone who lends her a helping hand when she was in trouble. Furthermore, it was not as if Lucian had not done anything to court her previously. At the very least, the herbs they had would be able to resolve the current conflict between Roxanne and Lucian. Lucian remained quiet while wearing a poker face. Taking in Lucian's reaction, Jonathan sighed in exasperation. Weren't you thinking about doing something romantic? What else is more romantic than providing help to her when she needs it most? Lucian narrowed his eyes indifferently. That's not needed. I'll do those romantic things in the future. I won't help her this time because she brought this upon herself. This mess wouldn't have happened if she had come here to keep Essie company instead of tagging along with Jack to handle those medicinal herbs that day. He took his anger wholly out on her for the occurrence of the fire incident. Jonathan was clueless about everything that took place during those 2 days, so he was baffled when Lucian rejected his suggestion. Lucian didn't elaborate either. He simply looked away, showing no inclination to speak further. A moment later, Jonathan couldn't help but ask him, Lucian, what is the relationship you hope to establish with Dr. Jarvis? The way he saw it, Lucian didn't strike him as someone who was trying to chase after Roxanne. Lucian knitted his brows in silence. Let me ask the question in a different way. Jonathan smiled tactfully. Do you still plan on pursuing Dr. Jarvis? This time Lucian glanced at him impassively. Jonathan understood Lucian's personality well, so from the latter's response he knew Lucian had tacitly agreed that he was still interested in her. Perceiving that, Jonathan let out a sigh of relief inwardly. He was under the assumption that Lucian and Roxanne had, unbeknownst to him, gone through too many arguments, prompting Lucian to have a change of heart. It's fine as long as he's still planning to win her affection. In my opinion, Dr. Jarvis is undoubtedly the most suitable person to be with Lucian. After all, it is very rare for Lucian to take the initiative to express his will to chase after a girl, not to mention the woman is also Essie's biological mother. It will be wonderful if they get together. At that thought, Jonathan was convinced that he should try harder to assist them in becoming an official couple. He cleared his throat and said, in this case you should show Dr. Jarvis more care. This relationship won't work if you constantly fight with her. Lucian shot Jonathan a displeased look and spoke up before he could stop himself. Are you saying I'm the cause of these arguments? Jonathan was stumped after hearing that. I don't know the reason behind their disagreement, much less who is to blame, but... He advised Lucian, no matter who brings about the fight, you must be more tolerant since you want to pursue Dr. Jarvis. All women behave in this way. Regardless of who is at fault, they will always hope for the guys to yield first. Besides, previously you. Jonathan stopped talking at that point and regarded Lucian with a meaningful look, hinting at the latter to understand what he was implying. Meeting Jonathan's gaze, Lucian frowned. Needless to say, Jonathan was once again reminding him of the incident 6 years ago. Lucian didn't answer immediately, nor did Jonathan utter any more words as he waited for Lucian to digest the message he was trying to convey. After a while, Lucian's voice rang inside the car. I got it. Jonathan immediately heaved a sigh of relief. I'm glad that you understand. Don't blame me for talking at length. I have Essie's best interest at heart. If possible, any child would wish for their mother to stay by their side. At the mention of Estella, Lucian's gaze darkened. He had to admit Jonathan was absolutely right, because the little girl had demonstrated her yearning to be with Roxanne more exaggeratedly than Jonathan had described. Lucian felt helpless when reminded of how desperately Estella wished him to win Roxanne's affection. That night, Lucian went to the kindergarten to pick Estella up. It was already late by the time he arrived, so Estella was the only kid left at the kindergarten. Daddy, Estella greeted him aggrievedly after noticing his arrival. He patted her head apologetically. I'm sorry that I'm late. Then he looked up and nodded at Pippa. Pippa had waited with Estella the whole night. Now that Lucian had finally shown up, she could rest assured and let him take the little girl home. After bringing Estella into the car, Lucian sat idly for some time instead of starting the vehicle. Estella urged him in puzzlement, Daddy. Her voice pulled him back to reality. He glanced at the little girl through the rearview mirror and saw a bewildered expression spread across her face. Have you seen Ms. Jarvis in the past few days? He asked. Estella became crestfallen upon listening to his question and shook her head dejectedly. However, she quickly turned delighted. Archie and Benny said I'll be able to meet with Ms. Jarvis tomorrow during the camping trip. If it weren't because of the fact that she had been looking forward to the weekend camping trip, Estella would have been utterly depressed in the past few days. She wondered if Roxanne was getting busy with work again because she hadn't seen the latter for so many days. Lucian nodded and piped up, What do you say if I bring you to meet with Ms. Jarvis? Estella's eyes lit up at once. Really? Taking in her expression, he gradually realized what he had just said and couldn't help but regret his impulsive suggestion. After all, he was still mad at Roxanne. Still, Jonathan's advice in the morning lingered in his mind the whole time. I didn't know anything about this significant incident where her research institute caught fire. I wonder if she's injured. Not noticing the unusual expression on Lucian's face, Estella urged her father in glee, "Let's hurry up and go." Seeing how excited she was, he knew better than to go back on his words. In the end, he started the car engine and drove toward Roxanne's house. When Roxanne returned home, Lisa had brought Archie and Benny back and was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Mommy." The kids welcomed her home concernedly when they saw her return. She beamed at them in exhaustion. The fire at her research institute had caused her a series of trouble. She had been staying at the research institute for the past few days to deal with the mess. Benny sensed his mother's gloomy appearance lately and couldn't help but ask, "Mommy, did something happen?" Roxanne patted his head and comforted him, "It's nothing. I'm just a little busier with work in the past 2 days." She had yet to inform them about the fire at her research institute to prevent worrying them. Benny eyed her curiously and probed further in an adorable voice. "Is it something to do with the email address you asked me to investigate 2 days ago?" Hearing that, Roxanne furrowed her brows slightly. She didn't expect her son to be so perceptive. The boy knew he had guessed correctly, judging by the changes in his mother's countenance. "I'm hungry. Let's eat." Roxanne hurriedly switched the topic of conversation before her sons could press the matter further. Meanwhile, Lisa had served dinner and called them to have their meal. Archie and Benny knew Roxanne wouldn't divulge any more information to them even if they questioned her, so they let the matter drop. Realizing their decision not to pursue the matter, Roxanne heaved a sigh of relief and led her kids to the dining area. The four were having dinner when the doorbell suddenly rang. Lisa went to answer the door. "Hello, Ms. Lane," a child greeted politely at the mansion's door. Then Lisa was heard saying, "Ms. Jarvis, Mr. Farwell and Essie are here." Hearing that, Roxanne's hand froze in midair. She was at a loss for words at that moment. Ever since what happened the other night, she and Lucian had never seen each other. She had no idea why he would come to her place out of the blue. She also did not know how to face him. Just when she was hesitating to invite him and Estella inside, Archie and Benny were already welcoming them excitedly. "Hey Essie, come on in. Have you eaten dinner? If not, you can join us." Naturally, Estella did not decline their invitation. Soon she followed Archie and Benny into the dining room. The adults, Lucian and Roxanne, remained silent throughout the process. The kids were the ones making the decision instead. "And Ms. Jarvis." Upon seeing Roxanne, Estella immediately snuggled up to her. Archie and Benny were used to that and quickly emptied the seat next to Roxanne. Estella smiled sweetly at Archie and Benny before taking her seat next to Roxanne. "Mr. Farwell, come and join us." Benny looked at the man standing in the living room. Hearing that, Roxanne tensed up a little and felt somewhat uneasy. If Lucian were to sit across from her, she was worried she could not eat dinner in peace. Then she heard Lucian's low voice ring out from behind her, saying, "It's okay. You guys go ahead with Essie." With that, Lucian glanced at Roxanne's back with his dark gaze before sitting on the couch expressionlessly. Even though he wasn't standing before her, Roxanne still slowed down eating visibly, and her mind was a mess. Earlier that afternoon, Herbscape Group once again received enormous backlash from the public. In the news report, the mostly deserted entrance to Herbscape Group was filled with several executives who had their hands handcuffed before they were escorted to the police cars. It was not until that day that the public finally got confirmation about Herbscape Group's fate. It ended up being acquired by Farwell Group. Roxanne did not have to think twice to know Farwell Group must have saved a lot of money to acquire Herbscape Group in such a situation. Did Lucian plan all of these? Also, what about the fire at the Research Institute? With that in her mind, Roxanne could not help feeling frightened. Miss Jarvis, here, have some. Estella placed some food on Roxanne's plate. Roxanne snapped back to her senses and forced a smile at her. Thank you, Essie. Estella looked at her with great concern. Miss Jarvis, are you not in a good mood? In the past, Roxanne would always take good care of them whenever they ate together. However, the woman seemed absent-minded this time and could barely take any food for herself. Hearing that, something flickered in Roxanne's eyes, but she quickly concealed that and said, of course not. I've been busy lately, so I'm feeling a little tired. Essie, you don't have to worry about me. Despite that, Estella still stared at her with a worried expression and would occasionally place food on her plate. At the same time, when Lucian heard what Roxanne said, he also fixed his gaze on her back inquisitively. He was reminded of what Jonathan told him. Is she really tired, or is she injured in the fire? Roxanne could feel Lucian's heavy gaze on her back. Although her back was facing him, she still could not ignore the fact he was staring at her. Due to Lucian's presence, she was no longer in the mood to eat anything. You kids go ahead. I have something to discuss with Mr. Farwell, said Roxanne softly after taking several quick bites and placing away her cutleries. She could not stand having Lucian staring at her all the time, and she wanted to know why he came to her place. The kids did not think too much about that and nodded obediently in response. Seeing that the kids had agreed to let her go, Roxanne stood up and walked over to Lucian. Let's talk in the study. Lucian nodded casually and stood up, following her to the study. Mr. Farwell, to what do I owe this pleasure of having you over at my place? Do you have something important to tell me? Roxanne stood in the center of the study, looking at him warily. If you're here to offer me the technical advisor's position for Herbscape Group again, I'm afraid I'll have to let you down, since I've already made it clear that I couldn't accept that offer. That was the only thing that she could think of at that moment. Noticing Roxanne was on high alert around him, Lucian's gaze darkened imperceptibly. The atmosphere inside the study also became slightly solemn. Roxanne fixed her eyes on Lucian, afraid that he would make any sudden move on her again like the other night. After a long moment, Lucian was still staring at her, scrutinizing her from head to toe as if he wanted to read through her mind. Roxanne's wariness for him slowly turned into confusion. I heard a fire broke out at your research institute a few days ago. Finally, Lucian broke the silence in the study. At the mention of the fire incident, Roxanne's expression changed again. She frowned. How did you find out about the fire? She did not recall telling anyone associated with Lucian about the fire. Could it be that Lucian did plan for the fire to happen? With that in her mind, she subconsciously took 2 steps backward. The man standing before her had somehow turned a little scary in her eyes. Noticing her reaction, Lucian furrowed his brows. Are you suspecting that I was behind the fire incident? Roxanne pursed her lips tight, answering him with silence. Lucian seemed pissed off by her tacit acquiescence. Why would I make a move on your tiny research institute? He noticed she was still giving him a doubtful look, so he narrowed his eyes and continued, if I was behind this, I wouldn't have stopped at a mere fire incident in your research institute. He had plenty of methods to stop her research institute from operating if he was serious about teaching her a lesson. A fire was too insignificant. Hearing that, Roxanne felt her heart skipping a beat. She was reminded of Herbscape Group's current situation. She knew Lucian was telling her the truth. If he were determined to get rid of her research institute, he would not stop at such a simple tactic. Thinking of that, her doubts for him finally dispersed a little. I'm sorry. I didn't think this through and thought you have implicated our research institute for your feud with Herbscape Group. Hearing her straightforward apology, Lucian frowned even harder. He had listened to Jonathan and came to her place to help her when she needed it most, yet she suspected him in return. Lucian was fuming, but her apology forced him to swallow back his anger, making him feel like he had nowhere to vent it out. For a moment there, his expression became inscrutable. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.